the many things that critical media literacy does is it invites us to ask questions of our media texts. And for the most part, we're probably learning about our politicians and we're probably learning about our elections from the media, right? We could go to a stump speech. We could go to some sort of rally. We might be able to do something in our towns with our local politicians. But for the most part, I would argue that we're learning about them from the media, right? So critical media literacy is going to invite us to, at the very least, at the very beginning, kind of learn how to ask questions about that, right? Our politicians will most likely never know really what's going on behind the scenes with them for years on years. But what we could do is deconstruct the language that they use, deconstruct their own word choices. What are they saying? I think in this age of firebrand topics, we get a lot of provocative language, but what's the action behind it, right? I mean, I'm thinking these days of particularly Texas and Florida with, resounding passion for don't say gay in the classroom and anti-LGBTQ work and the absolute attempt to eradicate LGBTQ. But what is the language that they're using? It is often coded as like, we're going to make our classrooms safer for our children. We're going to provide them a solid American education. I don't think our classrooms should be unsafe for children, but I want to know what that means. What does it mean to make a classroom safer for children? I think a learning about American history is probably really valuable, but tell me what you mean by American history, right? What is that? What is exactly that? Because I might walk into it thinking it's one thing, and that person might be pretending that it's something else. So critical media literacy is going to invite us to interrogate that. I think another layer on top of it is also critical media literacy will invite us to interrogate the coverage of what these politicians are saying. How are they framed in a story? I would argue that one really valuable thing that we could do with covering elections is before we even read the story or listen to the story or watch the story or scroll through the story, whatever medium we're using, what's the headline, right? What's the picture? We could learn a lot just from that, right? If we have a picture of a politician mid sneeze, I'm pretty sure that's going to be a negative story, and I haven't even read it yet because, like, nobody looks their best mid sneeze, right? Then what's the opening line? Who's quoted, right? Whose words are we hearing? What does it mean to have an unnamed source, right? I think an unnamed source is something that can cut both ways. It can be sort of a lazy way of trying to actually have evidence. It can also be that that unnamed source might be fearing for their job, and to be unnamed is actually taking a really brave stance, right? But that is our job as critical media teachers, as critical media literacy scholars, and as students of critical media literacy, is to start asking those questions. Now, I do believe that reading, listening to, watching the whole story is incredibly important, but I think we can really start to understand the tone right from the very beginning, the language that is being used, the visuals that are being used. And I think what we also get to do is do compare contrast, right? What does a supposedly named leftist publication write versus a publication that might be more associated with the center or more associated with the conservative or the right-wing press? We could have the exact same story told in dramatically different ways. That can be really confusing, and that can be super frustrating, and particularly for those of us that might have a single news source that we look to. Once again, we're getting some information but not all information, and we therefore are potentially kind of shortchanging ourselves on our learning. So being able to do that kind of compare contrast can be really helpful. I think more broadly than an election cycle, but I think it absolutely speaks to an election, is where are we getting our information? And I don't mean that even just by corporate or indie. I mean how, right? If we're getting our information digitally, which so many of us are these days, then we are building our algorithm, right? We're building our digital footprint. And in building that digital footprint, unless we're doing a little extra work, we're going to mostly get information with which we already agree. that's pretty nice, I guess, right? Like that's going to make me potentially walk into my polling place feeling quite confident about my candidate because I haven't necessarily been invited to look at anything else. So critical media literacy will also give us that broader context.
Well, we know we can't have robust democracy without informed citizens, right? And I think there are a lot of political forces at work now to basically have a hollow, ultimately meaningless version of democracy where people vote but they're not well informed. And so critical media literacy is a bulwark against that dystopian future. The more people are able to make sense of the news that they receive and perhaps then make choices to seek out independent sources, the better they will be informed about what's happening in their communities, the better they will be able to make decisions in their own self-interest when they go into the voting booth. I also think that one of the functions of the corporate media is to convince Americans that they have fulfilled their duty as political entities when they vote once every 4 years or in a midterm election. And I think part of what independent media shows that is often missing from corporate news media is the idea that there are so many more ways of being political, and being political in an everyday way that isn't hinged on an election cycle.
Well, I think the actual biggest problem, I think, that the United States, where I'm from and what I know most about, faces in terms of elections is that, yes, we are captured by the two-party system. We're captured by the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. It's virtually impossible on a national level to run a third party, fourth party, fifth party campaign. It is more possible on the local level. And I think local politics are really, really important, and they have possibilities that national politics don't have. But we are coming into, the 2024 election, and the vast majority of voters, regardless of their ideology or the affiliation, would not prefer that it's going to be a rematch between Trump and Biden. But it's going to be a rematch between Trump and Biden. It's very obvious that that's what's going to happen now. And, we talk a lot about polarization, that liberals and conservatives have moved farther and farther away from each other. I think there are some concerns about that are real. But what I think is most important is a different kind of polarization, which is polarization between voters and non-voters. And that, if we were to really look at the entire potential voting population, the candidate that wins every time did not vote. Just people who did not vote in the election at all. And it's easy to blame people for that. And to a certain extent, I do think that people need to take responsibility for not checking out of the process. But there's also reasons why that happened. And for a lot of people, going to the polls and having to vote either for Trump or for Biden or for somebody who has absolutely no chance of winning is a real unpalatable proposition to them. And so they stay home. We also have a lot of voter suppression that we could talk about as well. That's a different sort of issue, but I think an important issue. And so the media play an essential role in that as well, because one of the functions of media should be explaining to people why participation in voting, why participation in the electoral process is important, and really getting beyond the spectacle of political advertising and the debates, which are, really nothing more than, like WWE, sort of matches, and really getting into talking about the real issues that people should be thinking about. Climate change, economic inequality, the resurgence of hardcore right-wing racism, misogyny, anti-LGBTQ policies cropping up all over the nation. I mean, these are the really essential issues, and they get so lost in a media system that is focused primarily on profit and what will draw the most eyeballs instead of thinking, critical, engaged minds.
I think that the free press can be an inspiration for people to engage in civic engagement. I think that without a free press, without independent journalism, and without people with these critical skills who are trying to not only use the skills themselves, but to kind of spread the skills and get more people on board with the message of critical media literacy. Like I said before, you're just not challenging power. And so especially during an election year, we need to be supporting those forces, because if we begin to take them for granted, we can lose them completely. And without a free press, nobody's talking about the other side of the story. You're only hearing the side of the story that the corporate media wants you to hear. And so it's really vital that, especially during these like hectic times, particularly the last few election cycles, when we've had like such a rise of disinformation and such a rise of people not being able to tell their own stories, and like the destruction of the local news and things like that, if you're not actively engaging with the news and with your community, you're just letting things continue to be awful and to be the way they are. And I think that there's a lot to be said for like good storytelling, and being able to engage with your own community through the free press and through independent media. And so in order to be like a responsible citizen in a democratic space, you have to be engaged. And the free press is the one tool we have to do that. And it's the one way in which we get to interact and we get to speak up.
You know, it's interesting. A lot of people that I know, people who I know who are kind of, scholars and involved in, or like, people who have like very formal levels of education are very concerned with these questions of politics and civic engagement, because that's part of what you learn. But a lot of people I know in my life who are not in those worlds, they're just like, I'm fed up with politics. I don't trust the media. And what's interesting is that these people are trying to think critically about the media, right? They know that there's something wrong. They may not have the language or the analysis to know what exactly is wrong, but they have a sense that something's wrong. But the problem is that because they don't trust the media, and so sometimes they see that the media is controlled by very wealthy interests. They see different ways that that manipulates what happens, or they have the sense when they watch one news outlet or the other that there's an agenda behind it. And what it produces, unfortunately, is a kind of apathy, or a sense that I can't affect things. And I think that feeling of like, I can't affect the way that power works, I can't have an effect, is widespread. It's definitely widespread in the parts of the Black community that I'm a part of. And so people just kind of, I think they either tune out of civic engagement or they tune into other kinds of engagement that they think is relevant. But often those kinds of engagement aren't holding power, the structures of power accountable in a way. So people get distracted. So I think, people are demoralized a lot of times. And I think the media has something to do with that. And I think that, I'm just going to, this is, I know, not a short soundbite, but I just have to say it. I attended this sort of workshop for journalists where it was put on by the Poynter Institute. And they just had a sort of panel of ordinary people who were broadly selected from all over the country. And they talked about how they felt about journalism. And they didn't have a lot of positive things to say. And one thing I noticed, the journalists were like so offended. They were like, how dare, they don't know what the work I do. And I'm compassionate to that too, because journalists do work really hard. But I'll say, in the end of the day, if people feel skeptical about journalism, you can't get mad at the people who feel that way. As journalists, it's our job, right? And media educators, it's our job to sort of speak to the concerns that people have. And that means you have to listen to them, right? And so, of course, those people, if they don't trust those institutions, that's going to affect how they participate in a democracy.
I think that there is very important that people really know what their rights are. I just was reading about there's a bill which is trying to wend its way through the New York State legislature, that when prisoners come out of prison, they will be finally, if this bill passes, they will be given an application to vote. And they will be able to, all the rules, et cetera, are set down in this packet that's going to be given to them if this bill passes. But for example, in New York, in the country, there is such a huge amount of people who have been arrested. And if you're arrested in a felony in many states, you cannot vote. So that's a very, as more and more people are feeding this prison industrial complex, we see that it's less and less. There's a whole segment of society that is not allowed to vote in many states. So we're trying to state that, but not just allowing it, but actually encouraging voters. And I thought that was a very hopeful bill that can get passed. But that you don't read about that in the papers. There's no real mention of that. I happened to come across this bill in a report from one of our representatives. So I'm glad that she was able to get that information out. But where can you find that information? You turn on the TV and 17% of every hour is drug ads. We'll talk about media literacy. How many people even think, oh my goodness, yeah, that's an awful lot of time that is spent selling us drugs. But in the meantime, what is happening to this country? It's very sad, and places like Project Censored, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, all those organizations are very important and should be supported.
Well, people have been worried about civic engagement for quite a while. I should say, I mean, that the changes that have happened in the United States are specific to the United States. I'm in Canada, I'm outside, I'm watching, but there is also, I think, a global tendency towards a kind of reactionary populism, and Canada is not immune to this. And so we're watching that there too. But this reactionary populism actually looks to me like a form of civic engagement. And the people on that side of the political spectrum often make the argument that a lack of civic engagement has been the problem, and that we need to get people up off the couches and get them involved and worry about like the rights that they are losing as the woke liberals take control, right? And so I'm not arguing against civic engagement, but what would be nice would be a civic engagement based on greater levels of informed citizenry and media literacy and so on and so forth. And this is the problem, I think, with some of the way the left has positioned itself as the possessor of a truth that's been hidden by the corporate media. And if only people would become critical of that corporate media, then they would realize, they'd get angry and they'd get off the couch and they would get involved. This, for instance, is the kind of lesson that people take from the writings of Noam Chomsky a great deal. And while I have a great deal of respect for his work, I think there is something missing there because it tends to encourage a kind of skepticism. And of course, I don't want to attach this too closely to that particular theory, but what has happened has been a growth of the skepticism. And the skepticism has challenged a kind of civic engagement, but it hasn't gone the way we thought. And I think this is what we need to think about. This is what has been left undone, to use the title of today's conference. What's not been thought through is how to turn civic engagement into a specifically progressive direction and not merely to mobilize people's anger and rage. I have a big collection of buttons that I've collected from demonstrations through the years, and one of them says, "If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention." And I used to think this was a great slogan until I realized that all kinds of people who support Donald Trump and so forth also think this, that the problem is a lack of outrage. And we need to do something other than mobilize outrage. Outrage is very easy to mobilize, especially through corporate social media platforms. It tends to profit from the circulation of outrage. And so we need to do something other than this. There's something more that needs to be done beyond just simply making people angry about what's going on in the world. We need to make that anger more effective at meeting people's needs and interests in a real socially productive way, a way that can actually meet the needs of everybody, that is inclusive, because it's not easy to do.
It's a crucial year coming up. There are a lot of big decisions going on. The U.S. is a key player economically, militarily, socially, and culturally. So the U.S. election has importance all over the world, and I think everyone needs to understand that. And so it's really, really important that our students and all of us can understand the kinds of developments that are going on online and be able to start parsing out the stories. Usually during an election year, all we get is a sort of sports broadcast of the top two candidates and how quickly they might or might not get past the post. We instead need to concentrate on information that provides the background issues. How are the candidates going to vote, going to represent people on specific issues that concern them, whether that's housing, whether that's social security, whatever it is in their local community. So we need to support independent journalists and also community journalists and social movement, social justice advocates who are now stepping in to provide information and backgrounders. So independent journalists not only need to operate to, pull the curtain down so we can see what's operating in government, but also needs to circulate some of the other kinds of information that's coming out from people who are building community-based alternatives, whether it's for women's rights or trans rights or the rights of immigrants or the rights of people of color or the rights of indigenous people.
I'd like to start off by saying that electoralism will not save us. So I think we have to be realistic about what elections do and what they don't do, especially federal elections. Do you want the blue dumpster fire or the red dumpster fire? You want blue MAGA or you want red MAGA? I mean, those are the choices that we're looking at. And again, you wouldn't know that just by looking at corporate media, right? At corporate media, it looks like these people are totally disparate. They would be avowed enemies. But in reality, the policies are much the same. And I think we can just look at that, having lived under Biden, what in reality has changed. Actually, Biden has done more to destroy the environment than Trump ever did. Look at the genocide that's happening in Gaza. Biden is full-throatedly in support of that. So the lived experiences of people both at home and outside of the United States have not changed greatly depending on who's in the White House. And I think we have to be realistic about that. And again, that's why independent journalism and a free press is important, because we should be looking at it that way. And that would allow us, to address things outside of electoralism, but also address how wholly undemocratic our electoral system is, whether that be black box voting, whether that be gerrymandering, whether that be people being allowed to vote, whether that be the fact that you only have two choices and they're really the same choice, a long list. So I think those are all aspects that I think are important to highlight. And of course, that is part of the conversation when we talk about the importance of independent journalism outside of voting, right? It allows us to know what's really going on so that we can act upon it. You can't fight something when you can't see it. And so independent journalism and a free press allows us to see it so that we can fight it.
There's so many people who watch, for instance, debates between candidates of political parties, and they're not equipped to realize that it's all smoke and mirrors. It's all a huge farce. It's just, a big entertainment machine. We're pitted one side against the other when in fact the differences between the two sides are almost non-existent. So I think it's up to independent journalists and independent media sources to demonstrate to us how our system is flawed. And it isn't just about, the election, but it's about going beyond the election to do things to bring about social change at a fundamental level, bring about a change to existing, relations of production, of how we relate to one another. And another thing I think that's really important on that note is for independent journalists and media sources to bring up the fact that we don't have to have, society organized in the way that it is, and we don't have to have a two-party system. I'm sure they're going to completely ignore the fact that, for instance, Cornel West is running on a third-party ticket. He keeps changing, now he's running as an independent, but he's the best choice that we have, to survive as a species. I mean, we've got the war in Ukraine, which has us at the very brink of nuclear disaster. We're in the 6th extinction event. Like, the world is falling apart environmentally. The planet's going to become uninhabitable. And no Republican, no Democrat, and no official from any major party in any Western country is going to make a difference in that regard. So I think it's important for independent media and independent journalists to highlight these issues, these very crucial issues, because the corporate media is never going to do it. Corporate journalists are never going to do it.